You wake to the chill of stone beneath your bare feet, the torchlight trembling against the walls, casting shadows that seem alive. The tapestries are damp with age, smelling faintly of wool and mildew. Your breath hangs pale in the winter air. At just 12 years old, your body is slight, unready, but tonight you wear a gown stiff with gold thread, heavy enough to bow your shoulders. It scratches against your skin as if the fabric itself resists the destiny forced upon you. The door creaks open. A man steps forward, his presence filling the chamber like smoke. Twice your age, hardened by campaigns and negotiations, his face bears the scars of battles you cannot imagine. His breath is sour with wine from the banquet below. And suddenly, you understand that this is no dream of courtly love. This is your wedding night. The fear that coils in your belly is not childish panic, it is the suffocating knowledge that your body is about to be turned into a treaty, your innocence a seal upon alliances signed in blood and ink. The girl is Matilda. Born around 1102, daughter of King Henry I of England. From the moment she drew breath, her future was calculated. Her father's gaze, sharp as a falcon's, never saw her as a child to cherish but as a pawn to secure dynasties. His realm stretched from the mists of Normandy to the rugged Welsh hills, and every marriage within it was a move on the chessboard of power. Matilda's childhood was already shadowed by destiny. By 1109, envoys arrived at her father's court, stern men cloaked in black, speaking with the authority of the Holy Roman Empire. They carried a proposal from Emperor Henry V, a man of nearly 30, seasoned by war and ambition. His empire spanned mountains and cathedrals, restless dukes and rebellious princes, and he sought to bind it to the Anglo-Norman crown through marriage. Matilda was 7 years old. The betrothal was sealed on April 10, 1110, in Utrecht. No one asked the child if she understood. In that age, girls were not daughters but dowries. Soon after, Matilda was sent across the Channel, leaving behind the soft greys of England for the harsher lines of Germany. The voyage itself was a crucible, the cold wind whipping her veil, the salt spray burning her lips, the horizon stretching endlessly. Behind her, England receded like a dream she could never return to unchanged. Ahead lay the dense forests of the Rhineland, villages with smoke curling from thatched roofs, and the towering spires of cathedrals that dwarfed anything she had known. Placed under the guardianship of Archbishop Bruno of Trier, Matilda was submerged in the guttural tones of the German tongue. Tutors drilled her in Latin prayers, in the intricacies of imperial etiquette, in the art of moving with composure while her insides trembled. She learned to hold her head high beneath the gaze of courtiers, to speak with solemnity, to hide tears even in the cold stone chapels where she whispered her fears before silent saints. The saints listened, but they never spoke back. By the time her wedding approached, the child had already learned to wear a mask. The ceremony took place on January 7, 1114, in the Grand Cathedral of Mainz. Imagine the sight, soaring arches like hands raised to heaven, incense thick as fog, golden chalices gleaming under candlelight. The music of organs swelled, drowning her small heartbeat. Matilda, 12 years old, was draped in crimson velvet, embroidered with gold thread so heavy it seemed a chain rather than a garment. The veil across her face was meant to shield her modesty, but it felt like a shroud. Henry V waited at the altar, tall, stern, his hand marked with calluses from the sword, his jaw set with the certainty of command. His grip on her hand was not gentle, it was ownership. The vows were spoken in Latin, words Matilda could recite but scarcely comprehend. For the empire, the wedding meant stability. For Matilda, it meant the death of her childhood. That night, as bells tolled across the Rhine valley and the nobles feasted on roasted boar and spiced wine, servants stripped the bed in the imperial chamber. They spread fresh linens, for the sheets themselves were part of the ritual, proof of purity and consummation, proof that the union was more than symbolic. Outside, courtiers whispered, waiting for evidence that the alliance had been sealed not just in ink but in flesh. Matilda stood in that chamber, her pulse hammering, the embroidered hem of her gown pooling around her feet. The emperor approached, his breath heavy with mead, his movements those of a man accustomed to taking, not asking. No chronicler records her words, if she spoke at all. No parchment keeps her tears. But the silence of history is often the loudest scream. A girl of 12, a man of 28, a union demanded by power. For the empire, this was triumph. For Matilda, it was the erasure of girlhood, the first scar of a life destined to be carved by politics. Yet even in that moment of terror, seeds were planted. Seeds of resilience, of calculation, of the quiet steel that would one day make her not only a widow but a claimant to the throne of England, a woman whom barons and kings would both fear and resist. History remembers her as Empress, but beneath that title lies this night, the night when fear became the shadow that followed her forever. The cathedral bells that had thundered for her wedding faded into the past, but their echo lingered in Matilda's bones. As wife to the Holy Roman Emperor, she was no longer the daughter of Henry of England, she was Augusta, crowned Empress at barely 12. The title was gilded, yet hollow, and in its hollow spaces silence collected like dust. Her life in the empire was one of ceremonial splendor bound tightly with loneliness. The German court was vast, intricate, and often hostile to an English girl who had not chosen her crown. She walked among nobles who measured her every gesture, her accent, her attire. Behind their smiles lurked suspicion: was this child truly capable of embodying the majesty of Rome? But ceremony cared nothing for youth. Wherever Henry traveled, whether to Mainz, to Worms, to the Alpine passes, Matilda followed, draped in jewels, presented like an icon of unity. Yet beneath the silks and diadems was isolation. In the echoing corridors of imperial castles, she wandered among servants whose words she still struggled to master, her prayers rising in a tongue not her own. The empire was a mosaic of peoples and loyalties: Italians, Germans, Burgundians, Lombards, each bound to the emperor by threads of duty and fear. And within this turbulent tapestry, Matilda was expected to be the golden thread of stability. Henry V himself was formidable, tall, scarred, a man bred for command. He had wrestled dukes into submission, marched through snowbound passes, stared down bishops. To him, Matilda was not partner but proof that the empire and England were bound together, that his reign was sanctioned by alliance as well as force. He carried himself with the cold assurance of one accustomed to obedience. And though chronicles praise him as a ruler of iron will, they are silent about his tenderness. The years passed. Court festivals shone with light banquets of venison and spiced wine, processions beneath banners painted with imperial eagles. But no child's laughter echoed through Matilda's chambers. She bore no heirs. Whether from her youth or Henry's relentless campaigning, the marriage remained fruitless. In a world where queens were measured by their wombs, whispers soon gathered like ravens. Some said she was barren. Others claimed the emperor's health, worn down by ceaseless war, had failed him. For Matilda, each whisper was a blade. In her private chapels, she must have looked upon statues of the Virgin Mary and wondered, why had heaven not opened her womb? To be childless was to be powerless. And yet, she endured. She read. She learned to negotiate with bishops, to listen to lords' grievances. She learned the slow art of patience. Then came 1125. Henry V fell ill during a campaign in Utrecht. His body, once unyielding, was consumed by fevers and weakness. He died without an heir, leaving Matilda a widow at 23. The empire mourned its sovereign, but for her, the world shifted violently. One moment she was empress, robed and jeweled. The next, she was an outsider, once again an Englishwoman with no children, no protector, no claim. The courtiers who had bowed before her turned their faces away. When she returned to Normandy, the sea seemed colder than it had years before, the waves sharper, the horizon lonelier. She stepped onto her father's soil no longer a child, but not yet a queen. She carried the grand title of Empress, but it was a crown of smoke, a reminder of what had been lost. At Henry I's court, That title gave her prestige but also deepened her isolation. Whispers followed her there too, that she had failed, that heaven itself had cursed her womb. And yet, in those whispers, something hardened. Matilda had stared into the void of insignificance and refused to fall. Though young, she had seen emperors rise and die, kingdoms crumble, alliances forged in fire. She had watched how power was wielded, how men concealed weakness behind ceremony. She had been bartered, silenced, and set aside. But the girl who once trembled on her wedding night was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood both fear and endurance. The loneliness of her widowhood became the forge of her will. And when fate thrust the English crown into question, she would claim not as pawn, but as contender. Her father Henry I still had no legitimate sons, the heir drowned in the White Ship disaster. All eyes turned to Matilda, the Empress returned from exile. Few yet realized it, but Europe's fate was shifting. The once fearful girl, the silent bride of an emperor, was preparing to fight for her own throne. The English court in the 1120s was no longer the same that Matilda had left as a child. The feasting halls of her father, Henry I, echoed with uncertainty. The king was aging, silver in his beard and shadows beneath his eyes. He had ruled with cunning for decades, binding Normandy and England in a single crown through war and diplomacy. But one night in 1120 had shattered the future, the wreck of the White Ship. On that ship had sailed William Etheling, Henry's only legitimate son. Drunken sailors, a reckless race against the tide, and then screams in the dark Channel waters. The prince drowned alongside hundreds of nobles. With him drowned England's certainty. Henry I was left with only one legitimate child, Matilda. His daughter, his empress, his last thread of dynasty. In her he saw not only blood but survival. He summoned the barons of England and Normandy, and before them he demanded an oath. They swore upon relics, upon the Gospels, upon the bones of saints, that when Henry died they would recognize Matilda as their sovereign lady, their queen. The oaths were grand, but oaths in that age were as fragile as parchment. Many lords muttered behind closed doors. A woman? To rule England? The thought stirred unease like a storm beneath calm waters. Queens could advise, could mediate, but to lead armies, to dispense justice, to crush rebellion, these were labors of men. And yet Henry was relentless. He paraded Matilda in council, seated her at his side, wrote charters styling her as his heir. But Henry also understood politics was not built on blood alone. He arranged a second marriage for her, this time not with an emperor, but with a boy. Geoffrey of Anjou, 15 years old, freckled, fiery-haired, the heir of a restless and ambitious house. Normandy and Anjou had long been bitter rivals. A marriage might bind them, but love was far from the bargain. Matilda was 26 when the betrothal was sealed. To her, Geoffrey must have seemed a child, brash, hot-tempered, with little of the imperial gravity she had once known. To him, she was proud, aloof, and older, a widow who still wore the title of Empress as armor. Their union was marked not by tenderness but by quarrels. Chronicles whisper of harsh words, of tempers flaring, of separations and reconciliations. Yet duty bound them, and from that duty came sons Henry, Geoffrey, and William. Henry I watched this uneasy alliance with wary satisfaction. Through these children, his blood would endure. Through Matilda, the line of the conqueror would not be extinguished. And yet he knew too well the hearts of his barons. Oaths could be broken, loyalty could be bought. In 1135, the storm he feared arrived. Henry I fell ill while in Normandy, his body failing after decades of rule. He died without his son, without certainty, only with the hope that his daughter, the Empress Matilda, would carry his crown. But as soon as he was buried, ambition struck like a dagger. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, crossed the Channel in haste. With silver in his coffers and charm on his tongue, he seized London, bribed the church, and was crowned King of England before Matilda could act. The oath sworn on relics turned to dust. The barons who had bent the knee to Matilda now bent it to Stephen. The crown that had seemed hers slipped from her grasp. And so began the long war that chroniclers would call the anarchy, a civil storm of sieges, betrayals, and shifting allegiances. England became a chessboard soaked in blood. Matilda was no longer the lonely child sent across seas, no longer the silent empress paraded at another's side. She was claimant, contender, and warrior in her own right. For years, she would struggle, defy, and endure, carving her path not as a pawn, but as a queen in all but name. And though she would never sit the English throne, her blood would. For from her came Henry II, the boy who would grow to rule not only England, but an empire spanning from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Matilda had lost crowns before, but through her, a dynasty was born. The winter of 1135 plunged England into chaos. When Stephen of Blois seized the crown, he promised peace, prosperity, and the rule of law. But behind his coronation lay betrayal, every oath sworn to Matilda shattered like glass. At first, Stephen seemed secure. The church supported him, London welcomed him, and many barons, eager for a pliable king, pledged allegiance. But a kingdom built on broken promises is a house of sand. By 1139, the storm broke. Matilda landed in England with her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, illegitimate son of Henry I, soldier of rare skill, and her most loyal champion. With him, she carried not only soldiers but a claim stronger than steel. She was the true heir, sworn to by God's relics. The war that followed was not a single clash, but a grinding civil struggle, raids, sieges, castles burning against the night sky. Villages starved, fields lay untended, law dissolved. Chroniclers wrote bitterly, Christ and his saints slept. For Matilda, war was not only fought with swords but with endurance. She raised banners in the west, fortified castles, and gathered supporters. Stephen struck back with speed, his forces sweeping across England. Yet at Lincoln in 1141, the tide turned. Stephen, reckless as ever, stood his ground in battle even when surrounded. He fought with desperate valor, wielding his sword until it broke in his hand. But courage could not save him. He was captured, dragged in chains, and delivered to Matilda. At last, the crown seemed within her grasp. In triumph, she entered London, hailed as Lady of the English. Her victory should have been complete. Yet power, once within reach, slipped away again, not by swords this time, but by pride. Matilda ruled with imperial authority, cold and imperious. She demanded tribute, insisted on obedience, and treated the barons not as allies but as subjects. When the citizens of London asked for relief from her harsh taxes, she refused. Whispers turned to anger, and soon, bells rang out not in celebration but in revolt. She fled the city under cover of night, her coronation lost to fury. The war dragged on. Later that year, Stephen was freed in exchange for Robert of Gloucester, and balance returned to chaos. Neither side held the crown, only castles and fragments of loyalty. Perhaps the most legendary moment of Matilda's struggle came at Oxford, winter of 1142. Besieged in the snowbound castle by Stephen's army, her fate seemed sealed. Yet under the cover of night, cloaked in white against the falling snow, she and a handful of knights slipped across the frozen Thames. Step by silent step, breath misting in the bitter air, they escaped into the darkness. The Empress in White became legend. For nearly 2 decades the struggle endured, brother against cousin, baron against baron, England bleeding under the weight of divided crowns. In the end, neither Matilda nor Stephen would claim a final victory. But through exhaustion, diplomacy, and fate, a compromise was struck. In 1153, Stephen, wearied by years of war and the loss of his own son, agreed to name Matilda's eldest boy, Henry of Anjou, as his heir. When Stephen died the following year, the crown that had once slipped from Matilda's hands passed to her son. Henry II, the first of the Plantagenets, rose as king. From him came a dynasty that ruled England for 3 centuries. Kings like Richard the Lionheart, John of Magna Carta, and Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. And at the root of it all stood Matilda, never crowned, but never defeated. An empress without a throne, a queen without a crown, yet the mother of a dynasty. Her story was not of triumph, but of endurance. In a world that tried to deny her power, she carved a legacy that no usurper could erase. When the dust of civil war finally settled in 1154, it was not Matilda who wore the crown, but her son. Yet her shadow stretched long over the throne of England. Though chroniclers called the years of strife the anarchy, Matilda herself had forged order out of defeat, her bloodline was secured, her son enthroned, her dynasty eternal. Henry II grew to be a king of immense energy and ambition, the first of the Plantagenets. His reign marked the birth of the Angevin Empire, stretching from the highlands of Scotland to the warm valleys of Aquitaine. Behind his rise stood the unyielding endurance of his mother, the empress who had never ceased to fight for his inheritance. But Matilda's legacy was more than dynastic. She had challenged the deepest prejudice of her age, the belief that women could not rule. Though barons and bishops resisted her, she stood before them as heir, as commander, as claimant to a crown they tried to deny her. In an age when queens were expected to counsel, to comfort, to bear heirs, Matilda defied the mold. Her failures were real, her temper, her pride, her harshness in London, but in them she was unmistakably sovereign. She did not bend into meekness, nor play at softness to win favor. She acted as a ruler, and for that, men called her arrogant. Yet their very outrage revealed the truth: she had ruled, if only for a fleeting moment. Later queens would echo her defiance. Eleanor of Aquitaine, her daughter-in-law, would wield power across 2 kingdoms. Centuries later, Elizabeth I would sit firmly on the English throne, no longer questioned as a woman, and therefore unfit. Each stood on a path first carved by Matilda, who had dared to claim what was hers by right. She spent her later years not in England, but in Normandy, advising her son, smoothing the governance of his empire, and watching as her grandchildren carried her line still further. Chroniclers recorded her wisdom, her piety, her resilience. She died in 1167, buried in Rouen Cathedral, her tomb inscribed with words as sharp as any crown. Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. Matilda had been denied coronation, yet she achieved something rarer: immortality in legacy. Where others saw only a woman grasping at power, history reveals the truth: an empress who, though never crowned, shaped the destiny of England. Through her came the Plantagenets, through her came empire, through her came centuries of kings whose blood still carried the iron will of a woman once left abandoned in a foreign court. The Empress Matilda. Never queen, but mother of kings. Never crowned, but never forgotten.